you need to summon Aventurine, or at the very least, seriously consider getting this guy. As usual, the 2.6 patch is arriving with a few reruns, and there are a couple of really good characters. Among these characters is probably the best preservation or maybe even the best sustain character we currently have. Whether you are a new player or a veteran, I think you should really be looking at Aventurine as your next pickup. His kit might sound boring, I mean he's just a shielder, but he does his job so well that once you have him, you might end up placing him into practically every team you have. So in this video, I'm going to go through his kit and share with you why I think Aventurine is someone you should really consider summoning for your roster. Before we talk about that in more detail, if you want to see more Honkai Star content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Okay, a couple of disclaimers first. I'm not going to go super deep into numbers or builds here, it's just a general discussion of how Aventurine works and why I think he's good. I've had him since he first released, and after using him for some time, I'm just sharing my personal experience, so most of this is anecdotal. As this is only a suggestion, you should ultimately summon for whoever you want. Now, while I do want to talk about his kit in a bit more detail, I'm going to front load some information for all of you. I know some of you just want a quick answer and are not really interested in the details. So I'll just summarize why I think Aventurine is good right now, and if you want a more detailed explanation, you can watch the rest of the video. Basically, I think you should really consider Aventurine because of his ability to really easily keep most teammates alive. He has an on-demand shield and can refresh that shield in more ways than one. If it's his turn, he can apply shields for everyone. If any shielded teammates get hit, he gets a charge which then allows him to do a follow-up attack that adds more shields. If any of his teammates does a follow-up attack while shielded, he gets even more charges, meaning he can do another follow-up attack that, you guessed it, applies shields yet again. Basically, Aventurine can constantly shield your team whether it's his turn or not, and for most scenarios, this makes your team very tanky. There aren't that many things that can penetrate shields at the moment, and because he can constantly refresh it, a majority of the time, your characters won't be taking health damage at all. So if you're looking for a general sustain character that can fit into a lot of different teams, I would suggest you consider Aventurine. He is an exceptional defensive pickup that can keep practically any team alive. Now that you know why he's good, all the best on your summons and hopefully you get him. For those of you who need a bit more context and information, let's talk a bit more in detail about all of this. Let me start by briefly explaining how his kit actually works. As I've mentioned, Aventurine is a preservation character that, much like Gepard, can provide shields to his team. He does this in numerous ways, but the easiest is through his skill. Using his skill applies shields to the entire team, himself included, that scales off of his defense stat. What's unique about his shield is that he can stack them. Using Gepard as an example, whenever Gepard ults, he applies, say, about a 2000 HP shield to his team members. If he were to immediately ult again, the shield remains at 2000, if I'm not mistaken. The difference with Aventurine is that if Aventurine uses a second skill, the shield's HP goes up. So this means that you can stack shields to increase the overall damage they can absorb up to a certain limit. Now his skill is very straightforward, but when you have his talent and ascensions activated, this very simple skill becomes very powerful. Let's start with his talent first. The first thing it adds is that anyone who is shielded gets increased effect resistance. This doesn't make them immune to crowd control but more resistant to it. Aventurine, however, becomes completely immune to any and all crowd control as long as he has his shield up, but this can only trigger once every 2 turns. The talent also adds the blind bet mechanic, which is a counter that goes up each time certain things happen. Each time the enemy hits someone shielded, the counter goes up. If Aventurine uses his ultimate, the counter also goes up. If your teammate uses a follow-up attack, you guessed it, the blind bet counter number goes up. But what does this number do? When you reach 7 points, Aventurine automatically uses a follow-up attack on all enemies, and at the same time also applies a weaker shield to your whole team. This means that even if it's not Aventurine's turn, as long as enemies are hitting you or your team is doing follow-up attacks, Aventurine will have another instance to refresh some shields. Now this shield is not as strong as the one you get from his skill, but it gives Aventurine off-turn sustain because this thing triggers quite a lot, especially if you have enemies that do AoE or have a bunch of follow-up attackers like Clara or Fei Xiao. His A for Ascension also makes sure that when the fight starts, everyone gets a shield. So there are shields being applied all over the place. Finally, let's talk about his ultimate, which is easy enough to understand. His ult is a single target debuff that does damage to the target and increases the crit damage they take from your other teammates for 3 turns. It also randomly gives you between 1 to 7 blind bet points, so if you're lucky, your ult can also be used to refresh his shields. This debuff is pretty good because it basically means other characters just do more damage and most DPS are crit based anyways. So overall, every part of his kit has some way of applying shield, and his ult just makes your team deal more damage. When you put all of this together, this means that when you start the fight, everyone starts off with a shield. When you eventually get to Aventurine's turn, he can make those shields stronger. Each time your team gets attacked or does a follow-up attack, it gives Aventurine blind bet points, which at maximum allows him to yet again apply more shields. And even his technique, which gives defense, makes all these shields even more resilient. This is the biggest benefit he has. No matter what is going on in the fight, whether it's his turn or the enemy's turn, or your team is doing follow-up attacks, all of it amounts to getting more shields. In the right circumstance, Aventurine will constantly be shielding your team. Even if the enemy hits you a couple of times, the shield gets reapplied shortly thereafter, meaning it's rare that anything you're fighting will burn through all these defenses unless they focus down on a singular character. This is a huge benefit because as long as your shields are up, none of your teammates is ever going to take a hit to their HP. It is far less riskier than one compared to a healer because healers need you to take damage first before they can heal you, and if you're unlucky, your healer might not be able to do it in time. If a group of enemy focuses on a singular character, you are far more likely to survive with shields than with healing because it's kind of like you have 2 HP bars. Plus, there isn't a lot of things right now that can go through shields except for very specific fights like with Sam. The survivability of the team becomes exponentially higher because it's as though they have additional HP that can keep getting refreshed. In addition, everything scales off of his defense, so you just need to focus on a single stat to get the most out of Aventurine. Now, as good as shields are and how well Aventurine can apply them, there are some cons you should take note of. Firstly is that while shields are good, if Aventurine is your only sustain and a character gets focused down by enemies, you can't really heal them if they end up taking HP damage. So there might be some times where you'll be fighting with characters having only a sliver of their health. Aside from that, the blind bet mechanic has some RNG tied to it, especially related to his ult. So while you do have a lot of situations where you can get your shields back, it can sometimes be inconsistent. To add to that, you also kind of need follow-up characters to really make use of his talent. It's not a totally big deal if you don't have them, but the blind bet build-up will be faster if you have a follow-up character in the team. Finally, with how strong the shields are, there is the possibility that in the future, enemies that can bypass it will start to appear. It's kind of what happened with Zhongli in Genshin Impact when the Rift Wolves or Abyss Wolves appeared, but since it hasn't happened yet in Star Rail, you just take note of it. Now, if you're only interested in Aventurine, that's basically everything I wanted to share. He's overall a good sustain, likely one of the best you can get right now, and with how few preservation we get, it might be some time before he gets power crap. That said, I think it's important to talk about the other characters coming alongside him, especially if you have limited resources or even if you have a lot of sustain characters already and need other roles. Briefly speaking, both Acheron and Dan Heng are really powerful hyper carries, with Acheron especially easily able to break hundreds of thousands of damage on her ult. Both these characters, however, need specific team comps to feel smooth to play, with Acheron needing debuffers and Invibrator Lune needing SP positive teammates. While they are exceptionally powerful DPS, the possibility of being power crab is always there when comparing DPS against sustains or supports. But if you need a DPS, you really can't go wrong with either of them. Choosing them over Aventurine really depends on if you need a DPS or sustain more. There's also the new character Rappa, whose design looks really unique, but I don't know her kit well enough to say how strong she will be, so I won't be talking about her here. Overall, if you already have a few good DPS characters, I'd really suggest picking up Aventurine as he is a very strong preservation character to have on your roster. Even if you are a newer player, I personally feel sustain is a good route to go for first, since even weaker characters can beat harder enemies as long as they don't die. But at the end of the day, your Primogems are yours to spend however you wish. I personally have gotten a lot of use out of Aventurine and why I suggest you seriously consider him. If you're saving for other characters like Sunday or something, then that's fine too. Follow your heart. That does it for this video. If you found it helpful, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.